Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. Now I don't have a lot to say up front, although we are having very severe thunderstorms, so you probably will hear some rumbling in the background of this video. I do think it's going to be a short show this week, but I don't know until I get recording, so let's get into it. First up today from Zilkin Surge, we've got a mod that enables railway generation. Now a little bit of history for the game. If you're unfamiliar, basically we've never really had proper railway generation. Now there have been myriad occasions where someone said they wanted this or was going to work on it, but it just never really amounted to anything. Now we do have subways, of course, in the game, but those are pretty basic and they are limited in their scope. It's not something that connects every town together or extends through long stretches of countryside or anything like that. And the biggest thing that we had for railway networks was between the old style labs, and those have largely disappeared. Like I believe there was an underground railway that connected many labs together. I have not seen that in a really long time. Railways also come with the trouble of trains. Now I believe you can build vehicles in the game that use like rails instead of wheels, but there are no pre-made trains that I'm aware of. And all of these things present issues for a proper railway network, making all the map gen work together, putting together trains, and then figuring out how to make all of that jive with the existing stuff that's related to railroads, because we do have some buildings that are supposed to be like railway hubs. I think that they're in vanilla. That might be from a mod actually. Now all of that said, Surge has added kind of the basic level of this, which is to generate railroads on the map. Now again, this is a mod. It comes with the game and is found in the buildings mod segment of the mod select screen. Now it does say here that this is not currently intended for regular play at this time, which means you could encounter issues using this in the future. And if you enable this new mod, you will find that the world map will now contain railways. Now, these run between towns, both in the rural areas and in some urban areas as well. I did find some that go through towns. And I did, on my very first generation, found a railway bridge as well, so they are capable of bridging rivers, which is, obviously something we would want. Now, just in my casual testing, I did find a few strange map gen issues, just little things mostly. Mostly this was like small dead ends that split off from the main rails and then they just end abruptly in a forest or something like that. Now look, I really don't know enough about railroads in real life to know if this makes sense or not, so I'm just going to assume that the map gen got a little borked. I also got a few seg faults when I was teleporting around to various rail locations, but I have no idea if that's something with the mod or if that's just a base game issue, so I don't really want to put that on the mod and say it causes crashes because I don't know if it does. But anyway, this segment is probably longer than it needs to be. The mod is the beginning of railway development, which is something that people have wanted for quite a long time. And while there are rail bridges and rail crossings where necessary, I did not see any railway stations or like stops or cargo locations or anything like that. So ultimately this is just me pointing it out. It just adds railroads to the game. It doesn't really do much more than that, and I just wanted you to be aware of it, and hopefully this is going to make someone pretty happy. And if this develops further, I will try to mention it, and if everything gets put together really well, then someday this could be part of the vanilla game. So look, whatever, I think it's exciting, so it gets a spot. So moving on. Next up today from Candlebury, we've got an overheat mechanic for energy guns. Now you've probably seen this in other games. Overheat mechanics are, pretty common. I don't know. We've all played something where the mounted machine gun or like on a helicopter or whatever overheats if you fire it too long, too consistently, etc. Now this mechanic was added for some stuff in Aftershock, but it does also appear on vanilla laser guns as well. Now there aren't a lot of these in vanilla, but it does affect the core game. Obviously there's a lot fewer laser weapons than there are ballistic weapons in the game. Now to test this, I actually ended up using a mech, but all the stuff I wrote was about the A7 laser rifle. I couldn't get it to work, but the information here is the same. The way the mechanic works is that guns now have a heat per shot value, a cooling value, and an overheat threshold. So the A7 laser rifle gains 5 heat per shot and it overheats at 100 heat, but it also cools with a value of 2. Now I didn't see what the cooling value actually means. I assume it's 2 per second, which is pretty generous and means you're very unlikely to overheat using this weapon. In fact, if it's a reduction of 2 per second, I can't really think of of a situation where I would reach the cap unless I was using it like intentionally for testing like I did, in this recording. Or alternatively, if you're using full auto the whole time, but realistically you're not going to do that. Full auto is generally really terrible unless you're right up against a creature, so you probably won't ever bump up against this mechanic. Anyway, I couldn't get the laser rifle to work, so I'm actually going to use the Grunt combat mech and its integrated CMES laser cannon for testing. So the numbers here are different, but the principle is the same, and I really don't want to rewrite stuff, so let's just roll with this. Now the difference with the mech here is that the highest full auto setting actually fires 15 shots at a time, meaning it does overheat much quicker than the standard laser weapons that the player would carry. But anyway, when you fire a weapon with this overheating mechanic, a bar will appear next to the weapon's name. Now this is color coded and it will change color as it increases, with red being the signal that you're overheated or about to overheat or whatever. Now in addition to that, the mech posts a message in the log alerting you that the weapon is overheating. Now if you cross the threshold, there are a few things that can happen, and these are referred to as faults. They use the fault system. Now the only one that I could trigger in my testing was the venting fault, which meant that the weapon was venting heat and could not be used for a short period of time. Now it came back online after a few turns and was not really much of an issue, although obviously this would be bad if it happened in the middle of combat. Now the other faults listed in the files include an explosion, the gun melting and becoming permanently damaged, and then one that says overheat safety / overheat venting, which looks like the one that shuts down the weapon temporarily. Now anyway, my thoughts on this are pretty basic. Laser weapons are so rare in this game that they probably will not be a factor for many players, and those that do have them, you're probably not using fully automatic firing 15 rounds at a time, so it's probably not going to be a huge issue for you. Now the overheat mechanic itself is fine and I have no issue with it, and it even seems pretty generous. If you're using controlled shots, you're very unlikely to ever overheat. They seem to shed heat pretty quickly. I also think that the UI and the messages in the log convey this mechanic very easily, and it seems pretty straightforward. I think it was a great idea to add all of these log messages and things like that. So altogether, I find this to be a pretty fine PR, so we're gonna move on here. Next up today from Haraka, we've got the addition of Riverside Boats. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, it's pretty straightforward, and it just adds random boat spawns to the edge of rivers. There's a screenshot in the PR showing a river, and these circles are actually different boat spawns. And then there's another image showing what the boats might look like when you actually, walk over and find one. Now look, would we prefer to have proper docks dotting the landscape with boats actually at the dock? Well, sure. But river map gen isn't very easy to work with, and as someone who lives near a pretty big creek, you do see boats just randomly on shore. It's not unheard of. Probably not as common as they are, appearing in the game, but I don't really care. I don't think most of us care. It's just boats on the riverside. We have so little content with boats in this game. It's just, I'm happy to see this, just to have them appear more than just one or two locations that very rarely spawn. So yeah, I like having boats spawning on the riverside. I like it, I don't know. Next up today from Guardian DLL, we've got the addition of quite a few new vehicles. Now I don't have a lot of thoughts here, we just very rarely see new vehicles added to the game, and I really wanted to shout this out. It added a variety of vehicles, most of them seem to be compact cars, and there was a 3-wheeled motorcycle as well. Well, and at least one of the compact cars is also a 3-wheeler, which is interesting and unique. We don't really have that in the game. Now although these types of vehicles are becoming more common in the US, I would say that compacts really aren't that typical. I actually recently was reading an article. It was about the number of people who die every year due to traffic accidents, as they're on foot pedestrians who are killed in accidents, and that number has gone up quite a lot in the United States because people favor these really large trucks and SUVs, which are much more dangerous for a pedestrian. Now you do see these smaller compact type imports around, especially in bigger cities, but yeah, a lot of the bulk of the United States purchases are trucks and SUVs, so I don't know how common these are really. Tiny cars make me think of Japan. The US has specifically moved to increase import taxes significantly on these compact foreign vehicles. So I think it's probably hard to pin down exactly how many there would be in the States, and I'm not familiar enough with New England to have, I live in a country, everyone here has a truck, so obviously that's not a great metric to go by because the city is different. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Not a lot to say beyond those those sort of thoughts. I guess it also increased the time cost for installing some car parts as well, which I'm not really sure what that has to do with adding new vehicles, but it doesn't really matter. For example, the hatch now takes 70 minutes to install instead of 60. It's really not a big deal. None of us care about those 10 minutes. It's not going to upset anybody, I don't think. So yeah, there you go. You're going to start seeing these new vehicles in the game. Like I said, it's a lot of compacts, so you probably will notice them right away. I suspect the compacts will not be balanced properly for how uncommon they are in real life, but I also won't really know until we've played with this for a few weeks or a few months. Anyway, moving on, next up today from Carol, we've got some changes to bronze. Now, the main thing I think people will care about is the actual making of bronze now requires a book, which is the Alloying Reference Manual. Now, this currently appears to have only one recipe, which is to make a chunk of bronze. Now, I'm really not a fan of a book existing for a single recipe, but we just also don't really have other alloys, so I guess it's whatever. And for those of you who are about to scream about In the Woods gaming, there is apparently an auto-learned recipe for bronze if you're playing the In the Woods mod or whatever. I'm not familiar really. Now the rest of the PR was just to move some stuff around. The glass blowing book was removed from school item groups, as was the home distillation book. Like I said, I think the main thing people are going to care about is the bronze being in a book recipe, but also very few of us actually use bronze, I think. And you can still harvest chunks of bronze from whatever, but it's really rare, and I don't even know if it exists outside of player crafted items. I think there's 1 or 2 items that can be disassembled for chunks of bronze, but I'm just not really sure. Now I did see that many things that use bronze as components actually can't be disassembled or harvested for bronze, which is a bit silly. Like, we have more bronze items than we have bronze disassembly recipes, which doesn't really make sense because you should be able to harvest it from basically anything that's bronze. But anyway, it's not something that's going to affect most players anyway, so I don't think it's a super big deal. Next up today from Urk, we've got some really fascinating attempts to make NPCs flee more consistently / evaluate threats more accurately. Now look, right up front, this is huge. These are 2 very large PRs, and although Urk does take a lot of care to explain what he's done in these PRs, I am still not really smart enough to parse all of it. So I'm going to give you my assessment and what stood out to me, but if you really want to understand, you will have to probably read these yourself. Although, I mean, I don't know. If I had trouble understanding it, probably some of you will as well. Like, no disrespect, I just mean, like, I know a lot about the game, so if I don't understand something, there's probably a lot of players who wouldn't either. But of course, there will be links in the description down below if you want to look at these individually. Now anyway, the broad strokes here are that Urk decided to look at and try to fix NPC fleeing behavior. Previously, your companions would essentially just never back down from a fight. They apparently were having issues assessing the danger level. So the example used in the PR is that a single zombie represented a threat of 5, but 6 zombies in a group only represented a threat of 13, which doesn't really math out to make all that much sense, since, like, obviously 6 zombies are significantly more dangerous than a single zombie. Additionally, a single Migo was a threat of 27, but 4 Migo a threat of 55, despite the fact that, again, 4 Migo together would be enormously more difficult and dangerous than fighting just 1. Now Mark was a dev several years ago that I haven't seen in a long time, but he did just an absolute ton for this project. Shout out to Mark if you happen to, I don't know if you still watch these things or what, but hello Mark. But anyway, Mark did a bunch of work previously setting up zones and retreat behaviors, but they were never triggering because the way NPCs assessed threats was borked, like I just explained. So Urk decided to take a look at this and see if he couldn't make our NPCs a little bit more cowardly, but in a good way, I mean. And this is sort of where the mathy Cody part comes in that I just don't fully know the ins and outs of. Urk made these changes and asked for player feedback as well, which from the look of things, he didn't really get that feedback that he was looking for. Sorry about that. If I had seen this change previously, I would have, I would have shouted it out in a video, see if we could get you some recruits if I'd been paying attention. But anyway, after these changes and a small group of playtesters, Urk then decided it needed further refining. This was a second PR that made it so NPCs have a max danger level for NPCs to engage enemies, which is dynamic, and we're going to talk about that in a second. It also made it so that NPCs actually now feel pain, and as their pain rises, they reassess the levels of danger and they might retreat because they're in a bad spot. Now, this is a huge thing that people have talked about for years, that NPCs don't feel pain, and finally they do. And then finally, when your companion reaches a level of danger that they don't feel they can handle, they're going to retreat back to you as the player. So hopefully all of these changes should keep your NPCs from just running off. Like we've all seen them just run off to slap a horde when they should have stuck by you and not been an idiot. Now let's talk about the dynamic danger assessment. Now, as we discussed previously, different enemies produce different threat levels, which the NPCs evaluate to determine if they should fight or retreat. Now, this is not simply a max value. It does factor things like the NPC's pain, whether their enemy has a firearm, and whether the player is nearby. If the player is nearby, there is a substantial lowering of the danger level, since players are generally very well equipped to handle enemy threats, and your NPCs will feel a lot more confident when they're standing near you. So when your NPC retreats from danger to your location, or if you walk up to join them in their fight, they will reevaluate their bravery, so to speak, and then they decide whether they want to continue engaging. And then there are a few screenshots in the PR that illustrate this using the debug message outputs. So here we can see an example of the NPC's assessment of the player's danger level, what the NPC evaluated the original danger to be, and then how it refactored the current danger level to account for the player's power. Now look, all of that said, man, I have no idea what I'm going to put on screen for all of that. Now, all of that said, I probably missed some information that was in these PRs. Now, from what I've seen, this is pretty much fantastic all around and should just make NPC engagements a lot more dynamic and just overall less moronic. You know, we've all seen an NPC barge into a pile of enemies when they had a trash weapon in their hands, and they come limping back if they make it back at all. Now, all that said, this is very new, and Irk did previously request playtesters. Now, there's still more that he wants to do, of course. This sort of like AI stuff is never really finished. There's always some aspect that could use further refining. But as far as I can tell, this is an absolutely great change. And I haven't seen any bugs related to it, but, yeah, it's new. So just be aware that your NPC's behavior will have changed over the last few weeks, and there could be bugs associated with it. And apologies again that I was not more able to understand it more thoroughly. I think I gave a good explanation, but yeah, there's probably more that I missed in there. All right, next up, we have a mission for the Exodii faction, and this does contain very mild spoilers in that I'm going to tell you what the quest is, but not actually give you details on how to complete it. Now, this PR comes from Sarius Scaritz and adds a mission for the Exodii related to one of their warehouses. Now, essentially, you're supposed to get to the warehouse and reboot their antenna, and that's about all I'm going to say about it. Now, I initially was going to cover this in great detail, but then I was looking through and I saw Rubik's dialogue and became very irritated because, yes, I still think the way Rubik talks was a horrific choice for the game. And yes, I know people like it, okay, and yes, I know there is a mod to simplify his dialogue, but I'm of the opinion that if you need a mod to understand your game characters, you have made a poor design choice. Now, it looks pretty straightforward with the warehouse location and just a straightforward objective. Beyond that, go find it yourself and experience it fresh, unintelligible language and all. Next up today from Carol, we've got the removal of a bunch of ferals, except not really, because most of the ones slated for removal were not actually removed. In fact, only one of them was actually removed from the game. Now, the one that was removed was the feral diver, and this makes perfect sense because ferals are not smart enough to use diving equipment. Now, I'm a human, and unless I would go and receive actual hours and hours of training, I couldn't use diving equipment, so it made absolutely no sense for them to be able to do that. Remember, we have those non-NPC NPCs in the game as civilians. So apparently these humans are too feral to even talk to you, and yet people want to give these fully feral creatures the ability to use diving equipment, which, yeah, okay, but it doesn't make any damn sense. Now, the others that were slated for removal were the swimmer, the archaeologist, and the armored ferals. Now, in my opinion, all of these should have been removed except for the swimmer. However, after some backlash from the community and some feedback, those three do remain in the game, but or just tweaked on where and when they will spawn. Now, I'm not looking to argue about it. When these sort of things come up, a lot of people pop off and give arguments that very rarely actually justify the existence of those creatures. Usually it's just someone saying, well, I like them, without offering real substance. And I think we're going to end this segment here. Originally, I had planned to talk about one person in particular and their histrionic comment about this PR. However, I think wasting time talking about one person, even if they are extremely problematic in my opinion, is not worth it. So I'll just say that I support basically every change that Carol has ever made, basically, even when there has been backlash, and I think it's important to show that we support people. Carol has done a great deal for this project and has gained a reputation as someone who removes content and they're referred to as the Salt Goblin on Discord. So, they have a bit of a reputation, but I don't think that actually really means anything. I think they've done a lot for the project, and I think it's worth recognizing that even when some people come out of the woodwork to just say things that are childish or histrionic or hypocritical or etc. The removal of the diver here makes a lot of sense, and I also think that our lore between NPCs, civilians, and full ferals is not really adhered to. And I think any change that brings them more in line with, make more sense and be the way they should be, it should be met with normal assessments like criticism and feedback, not with these kind of childish remarks or whatever. Anyway, we'll just move on here. And then finally today from Gadget Patch, we've got the addition of vehicle proficiencies. Now these are various proficiencies that affect your ability to drive or pilot vehicles. Some of them also came with their own backgrounds as well, so you can start the game with them if you so wish. Now, I'm not going to cover them all here. It's really basically pretty straightforward, and the lack of a proficiency, low skills, it means you have a higher fumble chance on kind of losing steering temporarily. Now the idea here being that vehicles in general are very easy to drive or pilot, they always have been, even at low skill levels, and an attempt was made to have this be a little bit more granular, allowing you to gain both skill and proficiency as you play the game, and have a more gradual increase in your ability to drive. And here is where I need to pop in as the editor and give a more critical assessment of this change. While I think it's great that someone added these proficiencies, and it's nice to have a little bit more granularity to your character's ability, this is currently completely out of balance. Now essentially, if you do not have this proficiency, you have a very high chance to fumble while you're steering. And this is listed in the PR as basically 1 in your perception modifier. Now this might not sound so bad, but trust me, it is. So my test character here has a 2 in their driving skill, and it's not good, but it's not awful either, and all of their stats are currently an 8. Now the problem is that in order to turn, multiple checks are made. Basically every time you are passing a turn, a check is being made to see if you fumble. So let's say that you want to make a 180-degree turn while going at 4 miles per hour. In my recording here, it took me 14 key presses to turn away from the south and make it so that I'm heading straight north. Now in that time, I had 8 messages about fumbling the controls. So in one single turn of the vehicle, I lost control 8 times. In 14 key presses, more than half of them resulted in fumbling. Now this is obviously completely ridiculous. Also remember, I was going 4 miles per hour at the time, so this is the best possible turning that I could achieve. If I were going faster, this would have been even worse because of the additional time it takes to turn. Now be honest, internet, when's the last time you lost control of a vehicle while you were going 4 miles per hour? Even when you were first learning to drive, the odds of you fumbling, actually fumbling the controls, let alone 8 times in a single turn at 4 miles per hour, it's basically 0. This would not happen. Now I understand the proficiency is to reflect whether or not you know what you're doing when you're driving a vehicle, but this is actually just so shockingly ridiculous. Now for new characters, the driver's license background is enabled by default and will grant this proficiency, so a new character would not have this issue. However, if you updated while you had an existing character, you're now suddenly going to find yourself constantly fumbling the controls because you won't have that proficiency. It is in fact so bad that I would encourage you to just debug grant the proficiency if you're mid-game. I mean, that's up to you of course, but personally, that's exactly what I would do in this situation. Now this needs pulled back significantly, and the other issue here that I see is that there's also a muscle-powered vehicle proficiency, so if you're riding a bike, you will experience similar similar issues. And like, I'm not going to argue like the mechanics of riding a bike, right? There's a, you know, people, it takes time for people to learn how to ride a bike, just like it takes time to learn how to drive a car. The problem here is that you're much more likely to be ejected from a collision when you're on a bicycle, and this is actually a pretty big danger to players in that situation. You know, you fumble the controls and suddenly you hit a tree, or you hit a zombie, or you hit a building, or whatever, and you're ejected from your bike, and that could be a huge problem. Now, my opinion here is that the fumble chance needs reduced significantly, and there should be like a minimum speed for you to fumble. You should not be fumbling at 4 miles per hour. Almost no one in real life would fumble a car going 4 miles per hour unless they were like, you know, if you're juggling some fast food, or you're like one of those people who texts and you drive and stuff like that. So anyway, I re-recorded this because I like the idea of proficiencies, but really needed to convey how outright busted this is at the moment. It's pretty bad and needs to be pulled back significantly. With that, however, I believe this video comes to a close. Everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully this has helped you stay up to date with development. I, of course, will be back in a few weeks with another episode, and I'll see you next time.